Thank you for coming. I am Judy Laird Jacobs, the Executive Director of the Friends of the Blue Hills. And this event is sponsored by the Blue Hills Climate Action Coalition. It's a coalition of groups that's surrounding the Blue Hills and committed to working together to address the challenges of climate change in our communities. The coalition is composed of a number of groups and it's growing all the time. You can see all of the groups that are in the coalition on the screen. And it's a way, we started this series, the Climate Change in the Blue Hills series, as a way to connect with people during this time of social distancing on a critical issue that will affect the Blue Hills and everyone who visits it. So we also hope to give people tools and ways to become involved. The quick promo for upcoming talks on Thursday, April 15th, the Naponzit River Watershed Association will talk about water and watersheds in a warming world. We're excited to partner with REI on a tree planting and care session on Earth Day, April 22nd. And then the UMass Boston professor and Friends of the Blue Hills board member, Rick Castley, will give a talk on how climate change will affect the species that depend on vernal pools and wetlands. And that talk will be April 29th. So this is a packed month. All of the talks are recorded and posted on our webpage at the Friends of the Blue Hills website and the coalition website, which is Blue Hills Coalition, bluehillsclimateaction.org. So before I introduce Debbie, I want to give you just a quick Zoom notes. You can write your questions at any time in the Q&A, and Debbie will take questions at the end. If you have any comments to me about just, you can't hear or whatever, any of your comments will go to just Debbie and me, the panelists. So now I am delighted to introduce Debbie Merriam from the Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum. The Arboretum is a 25-acre property that lies within the much larger Blue Hills and Naponzit River ecosystem. The Arboretum's plant collection includes a very broad range of both native and non-native species. This allows a unique opportunity to study the impacts of a changing climate on a variety of species. The Arboretum Director, Debbie Merriam, will highlight some of the observations of the cascading impacts of a changing climate on plant species and its management strategy to adapt to these changes.
Okay, so I'm going to take it away. Thank you for coming. Welcome. And I added a few things since I wrote the description of what this talk was going to be about, and I hope you'll bear with me to view what I'm going to focus on. And that's going to include carbon sources and carbon sinks, and what are our responsibilities as an arboretum? How is our collection impacted by climate change, and what private citizens can do to combat climate change in gardens, yards, public parks, and wild areas? So I just want to talk briefly about the carbon cycle, because it's a complicated subject, but what we do need to concentrate on is the sinks and sources. And in order for the carbon cycle to be balanced, we have to lower our sources and increase our sinks. And so the sinks are forests, wetlands, soils, and oceans. And the sources are energy, transportation, meat production, and land use change. And climate change is based on this concept. If we are producing more carbon than is being sequestered, then the climate is going to change going forward. So the richest 10% of people produce half of the planet's individual consumption-based fossil fuel emissions, while the poorest 50%, about 3.5 billion people, contribute only 10%. So we are in that 10% as a wealthy country. And we need to think about what we can do as individuals, but also what we can do as organizations. So I'm just going to go back to this slide. So as individuals, we can focus on our energy use, how we travel, what kind of food we eat, if we eat a lot of meat. And the meat production has to do with land use, because land use change is occurring because more and more people are eating meat. So a lot of forests are being cut down to produce meat. So as an individual, we can focus on these things. But as an organization, we want to focus on being a carbon sink. So we are the sink. And if for those of you who don't know, so Judy mentioned that we're a 25-acre property and we are located in Milton, Massachusetts. And Polly Wakefield, or Mary May Binney Wakefield, was an avid plant propagator, and she developed her land, which was primarily farmland, into a amazing collection of all kinds of woody plants. And she did this over a 50-year period, and most of the plant material was grown by her from seed. So this is an amazing accomplishment, and it's truly a wonder to see. And she was interested in not only native plants, but also plants from all over the world. So our collection includes plants from all over the world, not just natives. So as Judy also mentioned, we are located between the Naponzit River watershed, and you can see this is our property here, and this is the Naponzit River watershed below us, and then the Blue Hills above us. So we are right in the middle of this incredible ecosystem that is hugely important as a carbon sink for our area. And this carbon sink grows as the forest ages, and I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. So here's a picture of Polly Wakefield, and she was not only an avid plant propagator and horticulturalist, but she was also very interested in conservation. And probably one of the biggest contributions she made was being very active when they wanted to propose to extend the Interstate 95, the 8-lane highway, all the way into the city of Boston, instead of ending at Route 128 where it ends now. And the original proposal would have paved over much of the Foul Meadow and located a major interchange on the top of Paul's Bridge, which is the historic bridge located in Milton. So this is the image. So you can see here the interchange that was never completed down in the lower left. And this is the whole Naponzit River watershed. And you can see we're at 1465 Brush Hill Road. We're very close to this big and very important ecological area. And so Polly was very concerned that this needed to be protected, and she did that. But at the same time, I don't think she realized what was going on in terms of carbon sequestration, because despite only making up 3% of total land area, wetlands sequester more than 30% of soil carbon. And so if you have never been to the Foul Meadow, I would highly recommend taking a walk. If you park by Paul's Bridge, you can go along what's called the Burma Road. There's an amazing a view of wildlife. I've seen fisher cats there, all kinds of eagles and birds, and also incredible plant material. So not only is it sequestering carbon, but it is an incredible wildlife area. And Polly was very instrumental in protecting that. But back to the Arboretum. So we are we have an amazing plant collection, and our collection focuses on woody plants, and that's why we are technically called an arboretum. And we have all kinds of woody plants, from shrubs and to big, old, beautiful trees. And in 2018, we were certified by the Morton Arboretum as a Class 2 Arboretum. And what that means is not only is a lot of our plant material is labeled, but we actually have more than 400 plant species right now. We conduct a lot of plant research, and most importantly to our mission, we do educational programming. When Polly passed away in 2004, she left the property to be used for education and community engagement. And so that is at the core of our mission. So what we mainly focus on is environmental science education. And we focus on programming mostly for Boston Public Schools from K through 5. And then we do programming for older kids as well. But what's most important about this is the fact that it is, there's been a lot of studies about this. And if young people are exposed to nature at a young age, they are much more likely to be interested in protecting the nature that they've been exposed to. So we feel that the work that we do this is the most important connection when it comes to climate change, because when people are connected to land and to the environment, they understand how important it is that these places are protected. We also do educational programming for adults. And because we're so close to such a large urban area, we focus our programming on helping people become involved in their parks or working with very small spaces of their own, or doing work with all kinds of wildlife organizations. So that's our focus as far as our adult programming. We also have a program for young adults doing horticultural work, and a lot of the students that we've had in the past, and hopefully after COVID, go on to pursue a career and more education in environmental education and horticulture. And then finally, we just started, actually it's almost 2 years old at this point, a quarterly that focuses on talking about our collections in much more detail, with much more academic research involved. So this is an opportunity for us to talk about climate change and how it impacts our collections, but also to talk about all of the other things that we do at the Wakefield. But this is one of the most important aspects of moving forward as an organization and thinking about climate change. This is all new to many of us. And so we need to be the ones that are educating ourselves in understanding what this means. Like, what is the crux of climate change? What can we do about it, and how can we help talk to other people in the public and bring this information from academic sources to the public? So I recently took this incredible class, and I highly recommend it if you're really interested in pursuing this further. Physical Science of Forest, Climate Regulation, and Carbon Storage through the Society of American Foresters. But there's also a lot of other great sources, and they're all listed here. And these sources are all free. So there's a lot of information out there, and there's great opportunities to learn as much as you are willing to take on. And this is a photograph of master gardeners working at the Wakefield. And this has been important for us. We're working with master gardeners now to include much more information in their academic teaching about climate change and the impact it has on landscape. And the other important thing we do is collaboration. So we're a small organization. We only have 3 staff members right now. And so it's important for us to be involved with other organizations so we can learn from them, but also that we can get our information out through their organizations. And this is a photograph of some young people we collaborated with Friends of the Blue Hills on this project. And these young people had been hiking in the Blue Hills since they were kids, and they decided that they wanted to do something to help protect the Blue Hills. So they got involved in an invasive species study, and they went out and they collected data, and we have that data now. And hopefully after COVID, we can continue this project. But it was a great opportunity to work with young people and work with Friends of Blue Hills. And then lastly, the Blue Hills Climate Action Coalition that this virtual series is part of. This was Mark Smith, our executive director at the Wakefield, was one of the founding members of this organization. And I think this is an incredible opportunity going forward for all of these organizations to work together to fight climate change. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at the Wakefield beyond some of the collaborations and things I mentioned earlier. And the big part of this for us is citizen science. And this is the way that we really feel that we can get young people not only interested in the environment, but also opportunities in science and connecting with nature. And we do this through something called phenology. So Polly Wakefield was mentioned, an amazing plant collector, and her collections focus on the Coosa dogwood. And we have more than 350 Coosa dogwoods on at the Wakefield. Now, this is a non-native species, but Polly was particularly interested in it because it was very adaptable to our climate here. So she bred these trees and she started observing the changes in them. So we use these trees to do our phenology study. And phenology comes from the Greek word phino, which means to show or appear, and logos, which means to study. So phenology means it's the study of reoccurring biological events, or the cyclical changes in nature in response to seasonal and climatic changes in the environment. So this is extremely important, especially related to climate change, because we think about if things are blooming earlier, then caterpillars are eating them or they're hatching earlier. But it's whether these changes are going to match up going forward. So if a migrating bird returns and it lays its eggs, are there going to be caterpillars for their young to eat? So all of these things need to match up in order for our ecosystems to survive. So how we do this phenology study is there's a Montessori school that is right next to the Wakefield, and we decided to recruit the 7th and 8th graders. They've been volunteering at the estate for many years, but we wanted to engage them in a much deeper way. And so we decided to do the Citizen Science Project. And we've been doing it for 5 years, and we basically do a training, and we take the kids into the landscape and we talk to them about when the plants are blooming, and we use these information guides. So they show what a bud would look like when it's opening, what the flowers look like when the fruit is ripe. And so they take all of the readings from the Coosa dogwoods and they enter the data into the system. And so far we've had 5,000 points of data collected over 5 years. And that's because the kids go out every couple of weeks, depending on the season, or maybe just once in the winter time. They collect the data and they enter it into the National Phenology Network database. Now, this is an incredible database. If you are interested in this kind of information, you can find out whether when lizards are crossing the street, or tadpoles, or they're lizards, salamanders, or when flowers are blooming. Any kind of information related to phenology is on this website. And so scientists are using this information to determine how climate change is impacting all of these different species. So it's a great opportunity for us, and it's a great opportunity for the kids. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trees, because as an arboretum, that is our focus. And we buy a lot of trees, and we also propagate a lot of trees. So we buy bare root trees and we pot them up, and we either sell them or we put them in our nursery. And as Judy mentioned, we are doing a tree giveaway. And because of COVID, we had the tree giveaway last year. We gave away 500 trees to people, and we had to do it a little differently than we had planned. But it was hugely successful. And the idea is that as an arboretum, we feel like it's an opportunity for us to talk to people about trees, help people plant trees, whether it's at their home, in a public place or a park. There's a lot of opportunities out there for tree planting. We also have our own nursery. So we plant a lot of trees in our nursery, and then we grow them up. And we're actually trying to have Milton, the town of Milton, have us grow the trees for the town, and then they would end up in being planted out. And this would be a great opportunity for us, but also to keep things local, which we know is also important when it comes to climate action. So I included this graph when we think about trees, because certain trees sequester more carbon than other trees. And then so older trees and larger trees will sequester more carbon, but there's a trade-off. They take a longer time to grow. So when we think about making that decision, we want to think about, well, what does the future look like for this tree? We want to plant a tree that's going to be there for a long time, or maybe we think, well, maybe we should plant something that's going to grow really fast, and then we don't know if it's going to be there after that because it will sequester carbon very fast. If it will sequester more carbon, but it will reach its carbon limit sooner. So I hope that makes sense. But so our proposal is that we plant trees for the future, that we are looking at planting trees that are suited to our environment here, but also will sequester more carbon going forward. So the average carbon footprint for a person in the United States is 16 tons, one of the highest rates in the world. Globally, the average is closer to 4 tons. So we need to think about that when we think about forests and sequestering carbon. So Massachusetts forests sequester approximately 21 tons per acre per year. So that's just so you can see the differences between the two. But what's interesting to think about forests in Massachusetts and all of New England is that in the 17 and 1800s, the majority of trees were cut down. So the forests that we see now, even in the Blue Hills, are relatively young. So as those forests age, they will sequester more and more carbon going forward. So that's actually good news for New England. So at the Wakefield, we have a lot of really big trees that are sequestering a lot of carbon, and they're not all native trees. We have some native and some non-native trees. And as I mentioned, Polly was interested in experimenting with all kinds of trees. And because she was connected to the Arnold Arboretum, who were also experimenting with all kinds of trees, we have a lot of the same plant material. So the thing that's interesting to think about is going forward, some of our native trees are going to have a hard time adapting to climate change. And we need to think about the fact that maybe some of these non-native species will adapt better to climate change. It's whether they provide the same amount of ecosystem service to whether it's for food for bees and any kinds of insects to mammals, everything, if they're going to provide that same amount of ecosystem service. So beyond that, we have not only an incredible collection of trees, but we have about 7 acres of woodland. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the New England was cleared for farming. And you can see this is a picture of our woodland, and you can see the stone wall in the picture. So this area was most likely cleared or almost completely cleared, and it was used for grazing. So it has reverted back to a woodland. But what's interesting to think about, as it reverted back, there have been a lot of invasive species. And so here's a picture of what part of our woodland looked like. And this was about 5 years ago. And you can see it's just a mass of vines and invasive species. And what happens when you have all of these invasive species, if they actually end up taking down these native big trees. This is all bittersweet in here, and multiflora rose. I mean, there's all kinds of problems, but the bittersweet is the big one. And it ends up killing a lot of these big old red maple trees. So we had to decide how we want to treat this woodland, because as an arboretum, we want to be doing what we can for the environment, but this is a tricky situation because it requires a lot of clearing of plant material. So over the past couple of years, we've been slowly working away, and this is what we have now. So we removed as much of the bittersweet as possible. We don't use any chemicals. We just cut and remove the fruit, and it's an ongoing process. It takes a really long time. But you can see we have just blooming. I just took this picture this morning. This is all spice bush, native understory, great wildlife plant. And then in the back we have, this is it's kind of a wet area, so it's basically a red maple swamp. And then we have some larger trees here. So what we're doing to rehabilitate is that we're just actually adding more red maples to the area and just continuing to monitor and keep the invasive species at bay. But I want to think what the other reason we're working on this part of our woodland is it's not only the trees that are doing the work, but you need to think about the fact that a lot of forest carbon is stored in the soil. So there's actually more carbon stored in soil than there is in trees. So we need to think about that. And when we're thinking about protecting woodlands, is that there's more than just the trees involved. And I also mentioned the fact of the land use history over the past, that the forests are only just beginning to really store carbon in this part of the country. So now I just want to talk a little bit about how climate change impacts our plant collections at Wakefield. We have a diverse plant collection, as I mentioned, and the biggest impact that we have seen is drought. And drought it's the biggest impact because not only does it impact the tree in that year, but it weakens the tree's ability to fight off other problems. And this past summer was one of the worst droughts we've had in many years. And it was interesting to monitor some of the trees to see how they responded to the drought. And it's this repeated drought that becomes really problematic. But as I mentioned, it's the combination of drought with other things that happen in the garden. And that is pests and pathogens. So this is one of my favorites. It's a gypsy moth. And as many of you know, we have had gypsy moth problems, very severe ones in New England, especially in 2016. So 2016 was the worst defoliation in 30 years in New England. And it had a big impact, especially on a lot of our native hardwood trees that are the most important for sequestering carbon. But the interesting thing about this is that one of the reasons that gypsy moth continue to thrive is because of drought. And that is because what kills gypsy moths are these, sorry, this is a nasty slide, but there's a virus and a fungus that both kill gypsy moth, but they depend on rain and moisture for them to thrive. So if there's no rain or moisture, they do not thrive, and the gypsy moth can continue to thrive. So you can see there's this sort of ongoing connection between some of these invasive species and some of our climate scenarios, including drought. And then the other one that has become much more frequent for us, and even over the last couple of months, it's really interesting, is that we have these extreme wind events. In fact, this year we've lost many large trees because we've had very strong winds. So this was right before COVID hit, actually in March of last year. And we had winds recorded at Blue Hills Observatory of 80 miles an hour. And these are hemlocks, beautiful old hemlocks that predated the Civil War. But they were also weakened by an invasive pest called woolly adelgid. And hemlock woolly adelgid is problematic here, but it's also made much stronger by climate change, because hemlock woolly adelgid is killed off if we have very, very cold winters. And so if we don't have cold winters, the hemlock woolly adelgid can thrive. So these trees we maintain these trees, but they still were weakened by hemlock woolly adelgid. And then we had this incredible storm event, which ended up bringing them down. So how do we deal with these scenarios? We are doing much more tree monitoring that we have ever done in the past. And that means we go around and look at all of our collections very closely and make sure that they are kept as healthy as possible. And we look for any signs of weakness. So we're trying to preempt any scenarios that could occur. We do a lot of mulching, and mulching is very important because it keeps the soil moist and it keeps the soil from compacting. And all of these things make a huge difference when you have a lot of drought. So it's really amazing to walk around the garden, especially this summer, and you stick your hand in the soil where there's a lot of mulch and it's moist and there's worms and the soil is light. Whereas if there's no mulch, the soil is much more dried out and has much more of a chance of not serving the plants that it's surrounding. So we do a lot of mulching of our garden beds. And when I say we do mulching, we make our own mulch. So we chip our own, when we have trees come down, we chip our own trees and we use that in our garden beds. And we also create our own compost. We have a little tractor. It's the hardest working little tractor you've ever seen, but we turn our leaf compost and we add whatever green material, with the exception of invasive species, into our compost. And it ends up being incredible soil that we add back into the garden beds as well. The other thing we have to do is much more pruning and a bit more careful pruning to make sure that when we have wind events and drought, our trees are much more sturdy and hardy. And this has been, it takes a lot more effort to do a lot of pruning, but it definitely makes a big difference in the health of our collection. And the other thing we've done a lot more of is bring in professional tree companies. We have a lot of huge old trees, and they are extremely important for carbon sinks, but also because they are the legacy of Polly Wakefield. So we spend a fair amount of our budget on maintaining some of these really big trees, because it's extremely important that they're kept as healthy as possible going forward. So I mentioned invasive species earlier, and I'm just going to come back to that because this is something that we wrestle with a lot. And the thing is that invasive species are much more adapted to climate change. They can respond quickly. A lot of invasive species thrive on carbon in the atmosphere. So this is something to think about going forward. How are we managing our invasive species? We don't use chemicals at the Wakefield, so it takes a lot of time and energy. But it's important to understand what the priorities are for managing these species and what the priorities are for keeping our collection healthy. And the reason I bring this up is so I don't know if any of you have heard of Peter Del Tredici, but he is an ecologist. And a lot of his research is about, as the planet warms, a lot of these species are going to be better adapted to deal with that. And they're still going to provide the ecosystem services, as I mentioned earlier. But a lot of what Peter is talking about is plants living in places that are very difficult to survive. So I live in Boston and I drive on the highway. And when I'm driving home, I see these huge ailanthus, trees of heaven. This is this plant here in the lower left. And it's highly adapted to very, very difficult sites. And it thrives in those places where nothing else would live. So Peter's argument is, if nothing else would live there, these trees are still photosynthesizing. They're still doing a job. And so maybe we need to think about going forward, what does that mean for plant? Should we be thinking like, okay, this tree is doing a job here, and we should consider that it might not be in a beautiful park or something, but if it's living in the middle of the highway, it's actually doing a pretty good job. So I think it's just something to think about going forward, that, we talk a lot about native plants, and native plants are great, but we also need to think about what are some of the, what is going to happen moving forward. So if you ever have a chance to hear Peter speak, I highly recommend it. He's really interesting. So finally, I'm just going to talk about what we can do as homeowners, or what we can do in the environments that we live. And I'm going to start with myself. So I live in the city, and I have a backyard, which is about 5 by 5, but I have this incredible oak tree in my backyard. It's a massive pin oak. And I take really good care of this tree because it is a huge carbon sink. And not only is it a huge carbon sink, but it keeps my house cool in the summer. It also keeps my neighbor's house cool in the summer, although he would really prefer I cut it down because he doesn't want the leaves to deal with. So as somebody that lives in the city, I'm constantly sort of fighting for the idea that these trees are hugely important and we need to protect them. And so this is my tree that I take care of in the city. So some of the things you can think about doing as well are you need to minimize use of fertilizer, because not only is there are natural fertilizers, but fertilizer takes a ton of energy to produce. It's a very long process, and it's very carbon intensive to produce. So I would try to cut back on using fertilizer, or as I mentioned earlier, use compost, which I'll talk a little bit about. The other thing is we need to limit our use of pesticides. They're bad for the environment, but they are also carbon intensive to produce. And I love this image because I've actually used many of these products on here, not all of them, but we use a lot of insecticidal soap at Wakefield. We use BT occasionally, and we use a lot of oil. So there are alternatives to pesticides, and I would highly recommend doing some research and using some of these natural pest control as opposed to reverting to using pesticides. One of the things that you can do is avoid leaving soil naked, because there's a loss of carbon and erosion. As I mentioned earlier, soil stores a lot of carbon. And the healthier the soil, the more carbon it stores. So I said we use a lot of mulch or chips in our gardens, but we also try to have a lot of cover plants, whether they're native. As I mentioned, we're not a flower garden, we're an arboretum, so we focus on woody plants, but we try to have as many other plants as we can. And then the big one is to plant trees and shrubs, because they absorb more carbon in their trunks than other smaller plants. And they also live longer, and the older they get, the more carbon they absorb. And so these are some Eagle Scouts planting. We're replanting our orchard. And during COVID in the fall, they planted a bunch of fruit trees. And I mentioned earlier about urban trees. So if you live in an urban area and you don't have a garden, or I would highly suggest that there are a lot of opportunities to plant trees with organizations, and they do a huge amount of work for us in our cities. And they not only, cities have heat island effect, and trees keep our cities cool, and they also sequester a great deal of carbon. Composting is a great opportunity. These, if you put them into your trash, they emit a lot of methane, which is very bad for the environment, but they also will help your soil a lot. And whether you're doing very small level of composting on the lower left, or you have the opportunity to do something bigger, composting is a great way to go. And then finally, let's try to cut down on our lawns. We've been working on this at the Wakefield. We've been slowly chipping away at our lawns and adding areas where we have all kinds of spring ephemerals and just plants that are not lawn and not taking a lot of energy of the environment. And with that, that's the end. And so if you have any questions, I hope that you will ask them. And thank you for your appreciation and cooperation. And this is that crazy snowfall that we had. What was it, in October, and the ginkgo was barely falling, and it was so beautiful with snow and the ginkgo leaves there. So.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. That was great and a ton of information. So I just want to remind people, if you have, you can put your questions in the Q&A. I'll kind of start out with a question. So I'm curious, you have a lot of non-natives, and I know you were kind of plugging the non-natives as providing eco services. I'm wondering if you have done any research on insects in the Arboretum and kind of done any comparative studies to see, because you have this kind of a lot of non-natives and how that might affect the insects.
It affect the insects. Is that
Yeah,
what you're saying? Yeah, yeah.
like native insect populations would.
Yes, yes. And so there has been a lot of research about that, and it depends on this, because the thing with non-native species is that a lot of them don't provide the same rich sources of carbohydrates for certain insects and birds. So an example of a non-tree would be I don't have an example, well, I do, but a tree, but say goldenrod versus purple loosestrife. So goldenrod is a native plant, and it's carbohydrate and sugar rich for all of the animals that depend on that. Where purple loosestrife does not, they still are taking the pollen from that, but it doesn't provide the same carbohydrate and sugar rich important elements that they would need. And so this is probably true in some tree species, but I have not seen much research about that personally. So I can say, so we look at the Cornus cusa that we talked about, that is part of our collection, and then the native Cornus florida, which we also have. The native Cornus florida provides food for certain species. The Cornus cusa provides a similar energy and food for similar mostly bird species, because they are the ones feeding on the fruit of those. So, yeah.
Do we have a question? Does Wakefield Arboretum offer a service to identify trees at homeowners' residence and offer advice on what and where to plant some trees?
So when we do the tree giveaway, which, Judy, do you know, we don't have an exact date for that, but there's going to be in a couple of weeks. Stay tuned. Look at the Climate Action Coalition website. We're going to talk about right plant, right place, and where you should plant trees on your property. But we don't do a homeowner visit. But if you email me, you never know. If it's local, I have been known to go to people's houses and take a look.
House calls.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the tree giveaway will be on all of the some of the individual members of the coalition site as well. So can you suggest how the Blue Hills Reservation's forests might be able to be restored? Wakefield has 25 acres with lots of PLC. The reservation is over 7,500 acres. Being so heavily used in COVID times, there are impacts and deer populations.
That's such a great question, because as Judy can attest, we've been working trying to do an invasive species study around certain parts, because the DCR is managing so many properties. It's really complicated. And there's a lot of red tape, but it's something that you just have to keep working on, and hopefully ultimately we'll be able to do some invasive species studies in certain very sensitive areas. But to be honest, I hike a lot in the Blue Hills pretty much every day, and I'm kind of blown away by the fact that so many parts of the Blue Hills are incredibly healthy, and the forests I just walk around and I think, it's pretty amazing. I mean, there is an incredible amount of people walking around, and it's a lot of impact, but I feel like it's they're actually handling it pretty well.
And Pepper, I would also add that we often focus on invasive species removal in certain areas that we think are, like, we prioritize the areas.
Right.
So why the reservation is, over 7,000 acres. Like Debbie was saying, some areas are doing okay. So we focus on those areas like Indian Line Farm, where there's meadow habitat where we can improve it for pollinators and birds, or kind of thinking strategically about where to focus our efforts. Another question I have for you, Debbie, and if folks that have questions, please put them in the Q&A. You mentioned gypsy moths. So, and I keep wondering, is there enough rain or not enough rain to keep them in check, those populations?
Yeah, so we know that the populations were knocked back. So this spring, I'm thinking, we're good for this year, because you would know if you walked around anywhere in the Blue Hills, I have not seen a single egg sac on a tree. So the eggs are laid in the fall, and then they hatch in the spring, and an egg sac on the tree looks like a little fuzzy oval shape. And I have not seen a single one. So this year we're fine for gypsy moth. We have to think 6 months ahead. So we're okay now for it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, I'm glad.
Yeah. I'm always walking whenever I'm look for winter moth and gypsy moth, and then all of the invasive species that we're always trying to keep an eye out for. Now we have to watch out for spotted lanternfly, which it's not here yet, but it's coming. So.
Right. So we have another question. How would you characterize catbrier? Is it an invasive species? Does it benefit?
So that's interesting. So catbrier is a native species, and I talk a lot about this because it's an aggressive native species. So, and there's a lot of it on the edges of the Blue Hills. You see it everywhere. So this is an interesting question, because it's not invasive. And it's not dominating. So invasive means it's dominating the ecosystem and it's taking over the ecosystem. So greenbrier is existing in the ecosystem, but it hasn't taken over the ecosystem, right? So that's the difference. So we manage catbrier by cutting it down, but it's an ongoing process. But to be honest, there's so many other things that are more important to focus on. I'm not that concerned about the catbrier. So, and it does provide ecosystem services, the same thing as poison ivy. People hate poison ivy. It's a native plant and it's really important for wildlife. So, it's only bad for humans. Otherwise, it's a fantastic plant. So those are two native plants that can be very dominating, but they're providing a lot of important sources of food for wildlife.
Yeah, your description definitely reminded me of poison ivy, which is doing quite well. So another question is just Asian longhorn beetles.
Yeah,
I guess they're concerned about
this Asian longhorn beetle is a huge scary prospect. As many people know, it was in Worcester, and they ended up cutting down, I think, 400,000 trees. Is that and it completely changed the landscape. And all of these invasive species are hugely problematic, especially out west now with the dryness and fires and things like that. We just have to, I feel like the most important thing is that we know we're educated about what these things look like, so we can report them as soon as people see them. And that's how they've stopped the spread of a lot of these species. But yeah, these are problematic, especially for our native hardwoods. And that's another reason to think about, we need to diversify our plantings. And that's one benefit that came out of the Asian longhorn beetle in Worcester, is that they ended up planting a huge variety of plant material. So if some other species comes and invades, they usually prioritize one kind of plant material over another. So ultimately, we need to think about diversifying our plant material. Yeah.
Great. I think we covered all the questions. So I want to thank you, Debbie. That was awesome. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And, it's great to have a better understanding of, how our forests are changing and what we can do to increase things. And as a reminder, some of the upcoming talks that we have are April 15th, Naponzit River Watershed Association, talking about watersheds and warming. And Earth Day, we hope to see you for, and Debbie will again be talking about tree care, which would be, that one is sponsored by REI. Then on April 29th, Rick Castley will be coming from the Friends of the Blue Hills to talk about how climate will affect vernal pools. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and we hope to see you later in this month. Thanks, Debbie.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you.